Kids can be dismissed if they want, or they can stay and hang out with us. We'll have more fun today. This morning we return back to Genesis. I know you guys missed it. It promises to be a great end of the book of Genesis that we're going to complete here rather quickly, actually. We'll be out of Genesis here as we wrap up February. We'll be wrapping up the book of Genesis. This morning we come to a rather long narrative in the book of Genesis. I think one of the longest narratives that we find in all of the scripture we find here in Genesis chapter 24. So if you want to take a Bible, I would encourage you to grab one, follow with me, because it's a long story. It's a fun story, but it's a long story, and I would encourage you to join with us there this morning, to read along with us. If you don't have a Bible, there should be one hopefully underneath one of the chairs in front of you, and to read along with us, because this is going to be a doozy of a story this morning. Here, what has transpired since the last time we have been reading. Remember, the last time we were in the book of Genesis, we were in Genesis chapter 22. In Genesis chapter 22, Abraham and Isaac proceed up the mountain to where God has sent them to go. And we see Abraham has been commanded to go and to sacrifice Isaac to the Lord. And he goes obediently and he goes willingly, and they climb the mountain. And we don't know what's going to happen as we see the story unfold, but as we know, when they get up there, Abraham bounds Isaac and he prepares the altar for the sacrifice, and he raises the knife and he gets ready to slaughter his son. And there an angel cries out and he says, "Stop." And we know the end of the story. A ram is caught in the thicket, and God has provided. And he says, "Since you fear the Lord, I know that you fear the Lord." Abraham stops and he worships. And the story goes on, and we see the promise continue through Isaac. The promise of the multitude of the nations, the promise of God blessing his people, and God bringing about the promise of redemption through Genesis chapter 3, verses 15. And in Genesis chapter 23, something we're not going to spend a lot of time on, is in Genesis chapter 23, Sarah dies. She was young. She dies at a right young age of 127, right? We are all very young. I mean, I'm almost 100 years older than her. Not quite, but almost. We are young, right? I mean, we can all go shovel some more snow at this rate. I mean, if she dies at 127, but she shows the matriarch of the people of God. Eve was the mother of all the living. Sarah is the mother of the faithful. We see that her story is building on the faithful, but Sarah is mourned. Abraham mourns the passing of his wife, of the mother of Isaac. It's a sad time here in Genesis chapter 23, but we see this story unravel. Abraham goes and he barters in Ephraim with the Hittites to find land to bury him, because we know Abraham is but a wanderer. He doesn't have land. He doesn't have a burial plot. He doesn't have a tomb. He doesn't have a place to go bury his beloved spouse. So he has to go barter for a burial place. And we see that in Genesis chapter 23, he actually goes and he buys land after bartering. They say, "We'll just give you the land. You are well respected among us. You're a man of respect. We'll just give you the land." And Abraham goes, "No, I'm going to buy the land. I'm going to purchase this land." And now what's interesting here is this is the same land that all throughout we've seen this journey of Abraham since Genesis chapter 12. This is the same land that God has promised to give him. And here in Genesis chapter 23, Abraham is buying a small piece of it. A small piece is going to be the tomb of Sarah, the tomb of Abraham, the tomb of Isaac and Jacob, the tomb of the lineage of the people of Abraham. But here he's buying a small piece of it. He's buying into the promise of God. He's showing great faith in God, because here he's buying a piece of it. Buying a piece of the promise. Because here we know is going to happen if we are to read ahead, is that God is going to go back and give all the land right? All the land he's going to give back to the people of God. But here he's making an investment in the promise of God, saying, by faith, this is where I'm supposed to be. By faith, this is where my family is going to be. So she is going to be buried here. We're not going to take the journey back home, but we are here. We are people who belong here. And so she is buried here in the field of Malchpeth, east of Mamre. Now, what's important about Mamre? Right? The Mamre is important because we go back to Genesis chapter 15. It's at Mamre where God and the two men visit Abram and Sarah and say, you are going to have a child. And the child is going to be born to you named Isaac. Right? So this is a very important place. Now, as we get into Genesis chapter 24 now, after we just skimmed over two very large portions, it says, now Abraham was old, was well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but you will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. The servant said to him, perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said to him, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you must be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master and swore to him concerning this matter. In the opening of chapter 24, in these opening 9 verses, we come to an important transition happening here. Abraham is old, right? That's a promise we see that God promises. You are going to live to be an old age. You are going to die in old age, right? In Genesis chapter 15, the promise is you are not going to die young. These people are not going to take you captive. You are not going to be killed early off, but you're going to live to an old age. In Genesis chapter 24, it says, now Abraham was old, he was well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Now Abraham is having this conversation with himself. He says thinks he's close to death. Now, the problem with this picture is if we remember the promise is the promise that redemption is going to come. One is going to come from Eve that's going to rise up and crush the head of Satan. The promise from Genesis chapter 12 to Abram is that one is going to come from his line to carry on that promise, that his multitude or his descendants are going to be multitudes that are going to be as numerous as the stars in the heaven, as numerous as the sands on the seashore. Well, so far we've had Abraham and we've had Sarah, and that lasted for 25 plus years. And then we've had Abraham plus Sarah plus Isaac. Now Sarah is dead, so we went from 3 to 2, right? And so Abraham is sitting here thinking, it's me and Isaac. I'm going to die. We're going to be back down to 1. We have a problem here. So Isaac needs a wife. So we need to figure out this equation here, because the promise of a multitude of nations hasn't happened yet. Isaac is the bearer of the promise now, but if Isaac is not married, then how does the promise go on? Right? We can say, well, Isaac is the promise bearer here. That's great, but he has to have a wife, and so we have to keep this promise going on. Relate this back to us over here for a moment. Marriage is important, right? Marriage is important for the fulfilling of God's promise, because without marriage, Isaac dies, the promise stops, and we're not here. None of us are in this room because the promise stopped with Isaac. Marriage, sexual identity, all that stuff is important, and we can't confuse it now because we live in a different age and we say cultural identity is different. No, marriage is important. It's ultimately defined by God. It's ultimately important, and Abraham in this moment says marriage is important, and he's concerned, and he wraps his head around this and he says it's hugely important. It's hugely important. Not only is it important, but here in chapter 24, he says, I must find a wife for my son. Now, we talked about this a few weeks ago. I think it's a good idea. But here he comes back and he says, and it must not be from the land of which I'm living. Why? Because he lives in the land of the Canaanites. If we take ourselves and flip our Bibles back to Genesis chapter 9, why are the Canaanites not part of this plan here? Well, the Canaanites, when Noah came off the boat, he got drunk a few years later, and one of his sons uncovered his nakedness. Now, this was a little bit of a weird scheme that happened here. One of his sons uncovered his nakedness. He cursed his grandson. His grandson's name was Canaan, therefore the Canaanites. So the Canaanites are of a cursed people. Here, Abram has been taken to the land of the Canaanites. So Isaac can't marry one of the cursed people, because what happens when you marry someone who is worshiping false gods? You can be tempted to worship them as well. What happened to Solomon at the end of his reign? He married multiple wives who were worshiping gods who weren't God, and his kingdom fell because he was tempted, and he likewise began worshiping them as well. So we see that even now, Abraham, in his wisdom, his faith may have faltered. He may have questioned things. He may not have been altogether early on. Even when God was demonstrating his promises early on, he would say, but God, are you really my protector? Are you really? Every time God gave him a promise, he would say, but what about this? Every time God said in Genesis chapter 15, I am your protector, I am your all, but then he would come say, but what about this? Here in Genesis chapter 24, Abraham seems to be demonstrating the greatest faith of his whole life. Because here he is remembering and living out the promise of God. Because it is ultimately important that Isaac marry to carry on the promise. It is ultimately important that Isaac marry someone from the people of God so that he not be tempted. Right? It is ultimately important that the line of the promise go on. The care that Abraham is taking for something is not something that we should just pass up as an overprotective father or a small detail, but rather a father and a follower of the Lord who recognizes the urgency of not giving away his son in marriage to a spouse who worships idols or other gods, but the one who loves the Lord. The urgency Abram expresses here is not just an overprotective father, but a father who is faithful, a father who knows, who has heard, who believes the promise of God, that this is the land that will be given back to his descendants, a father who is living in and experiencing the promise of God, a father who trusts God. Isaac is not to go back to the land of Abraham. Why? Lest he be tempted to stay there. The bride is to come to him. The blessing is to continue here. Isaac is not to go back here in case he were to think Hebron is the better place. The bride is to come here so that the blessing and the promise is to continue here. The promise is rooted here, is to grow here, in this desolate place. When we read further in Genesis chapter 24, we're going to read that Isaac is in the land of the Negev. Now, if you go do geography real quick, Negev is one of the most desolate places on the planet. It is today, it was then. It's not like it's all of a sudden become desolate. It always has been. Isaac goes back to the land of Abraham. It's a bountiful living place. Are you going to choose to live in a desert? Are you going to choose to live in a place that's bountiful, where Abraham grew up with anything and everything he could have, where Isaac's rightful inheritance was? Right? Here, Abraham is nearing his end. The promise in Genesis chapter 15 that he would live to a good old age is coming. It's on display. Perhaps now more than any other time in his life, he is sticking it out in this land. He is planning for the future of his family here. He has purchased the land for his family to be buried. He is recognizing that while the purchase is small, in the moment it shows the commitment to God who has promised them all of the lands that they are in. They are going to inherit all of this. This tomb is but a small piece of the land for the descendants of Abraham, and this is only the beginning. Here in Hebrews 11, we read, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going, but by faith he went to live in the land of the promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise, for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer, get this, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man and him as good as dead were born descendants, as many as the stars of the heaven, as innumerable as the grains of sand by the seashore. Now catch this. We've read this earlier in our study of Genesis. Verse 13 is extremely important in Hebrews 11. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen and greeted them from afar, and having a knowledge that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they were seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that from which they had gone out, this is important here in context of what Abraham's talking about. For if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Take us back to our reading earlier, Revelation 19 in chapter 24, verse 10. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels, and he departed, taking all sorts of choice gifts from his master. And he rose and he went to Mesopotamia to the city of Nahor, and he made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at the time of the evening, the time when women go out to draw water. And he said, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young women to whom I shall say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels, let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. Before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, underline that, Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, kinsman here, came out with water, with her water jar on her shoulder. The young woman was very attractive in appearance, a maiden whom no man had known. She went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, please give me a little water to drink from your jar. She said, drink, my lord. And she quickly let down her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. When she had finished giving him a drink, she said, I will draw water for your camels also. Cue the farmersonly.com jingle. Until they had finished drinking. So she quickly emptied her jar in the trough and ran again to the well, to the water, and she drew for all his camels, a match made in heaven. The man gazed at her in silence to learn whether the Lord had prospered his journey or not. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing half a shekel and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels and said, please tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night? She said to him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. She added, we have plenty of both straw and fodder and room to spend the night. The man bowed his head and worshiped the Lord. Underline that. She said, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. As for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman. The young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. I mean, if this isn't about matchmaking, this is about as scandalous as the book of Ruth. The head of Abraham's household embarks on this journey back to the land from which the original journey began. Can you picture this? They left this land decades ago, 70, 80, maybe even 90 years prior to this return trip. And for the first time, someone is going to return back to the land and to the people of Abraham. For the first time that we know of, they're going to get a status update. They're going to know that Abraham is still alive. They must have thought it was crazy so many years ago for him to go and to leave everything behind, not knowing where he was going, taking only his livestock, his servants, and what he had with him. Now the head of his household is going to return. Right? This has to be strange. It's not like there was the time of the internet, not the time of the phone or the email or anything like that. His servant is going to return decades later to give a status update. And all the time, the people are thinking, that man has lost his mind. He went off and left us. He had this great inheritance, and he just left, and he was going to a land of which God was going to show him. And Sarah was just tagging along. She thought he was crazy this whole time anyway. And now someone returns. Someone returns. And the story gets a little bit more interesting as we just read. The servant doesn't lay down a fleece as we know in the story of Gideon. There is no asking of magic to occur here. But we see that not only is Abraham's faith strong in the buying of the tomb, but the faith of his servant is strong as well. For he arrives in the land. He goes, he arrives, and then he begins to pray. He doesn't devise a scheme. He doesn't devise a political strategy. He doesn't put up posters saying, most eligible bachelor in the land of the wandering. There's none of that. He doesn't get on the internet and try to, put posters up. He doesn't do any of that. He stops and he prays. He doesn't try to paint a rosy picture of Isaac. It's not like he's the matchmaker here. Right? Of all the things he could have done, he doesn't do those. He stops and he prays that God would bring the woman to the stream and offer him some water and his camel some water. Creative, right? Think about this in your head. If you've been sent on a journey that could take anywhere from 20 to 50 days, you've got a lot of time to think. It's hot outside. It's a long journey. You can't bring Isaac back. If she doesn't come back, well, you're at a loss. You've taken a 20 to 50-day journey, and you're just going to go back and tell Abraham, who's dying and or dead when you get back, I failed. So most of us in this room are going to be thinking, well, what can I do to make this happen? He can't come here. She has to go there. I can't tell her we're exactly in a desert. That's not really attractive. Flowers, pictures. We don't have flowers in the desert. Not going to work. Cacti, probably not the best idea. But he doesn't do those things. His faith in the sovereignty and the trust of God. And if we go back and we look at verse 15, it says, before he finishes speaking, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, that stuff's all very important. We say, why are their names in the Bible? It doesn't really matter. That stuff's hugely important because it's Abraham's brother came out with her water jar on her shoulder. So it's a kinsman. The dynastic line of Abraham is going to continue. It's not just some random chick from the town came out to get some water, but it's somebody from the line of Abraham is coming out to get water. Not only was the servant's prayer going to be answered, but it's going to be answered through the kinsman, which is extremely important, displaying the promise of the family line, the people of God. The people of God are going to continue. But here comes Rebekah. The servant is still praying, and he asks her for water in a culture where a virgin speaking to a man is not really kosher. But he doesn't just ask her for water. He says, are you going to water the camels as well? Now, certainly, this is the plan of God. But then he gets a bit forward. Is there a place to stay? And we see the ultimate display of hospitality. Quite the cultural theme here. For them to open their homes and bring you in. This picture of the sovereignty of God working out the plan of God and the people of God We have plenty of both straw and fodder and room to spend the night. The man bows his head and he worships and he says, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. As for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman." Faith. Faith. Think about it for a moment. If we were just to stop here and to not continue reading the story, this is an impossible task. It is legitimately going and finding a needle in a haystack. You're going to travel across the land for 20 to 50 days. You're supposed to go find a wife for your servant who you can't bring with you. He probably doesn't even know you're going. You just happen to stop at a spring where the young women are going to come out and get water at some point during the day. You're going to pray. God is going to answer your prayer before you finish praying. And you worship. When we're faced with those impossible tasks and those impossible moments, for whether it be finding a spouse or dealing with life or dealing with struggles, the faith of Abraham staying in the land, burying his wife and not returning home, the faith of the servant traveling to the land, being faithful to his master, the faith of the servant stopping and praying. These aren't just Old Testament stories. These are the words of God, the display of God acting on his behalf of his people. If we were to just stop there, this is an amazing, beautiful story of God acting on behalf of his people. But great for us, the story doesn't stop. Let's figure out how this romance goes. Verse 29. If you like daytime soaps, then this is going to get a lot better. I know some of you have to. I hear the Counseling Days of Our Lives. I mean, this is going to fill in for you for a few weeks. You guys are not awake this morning. I'm trying real hard. This is a long passage. Verse 29. Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. Laban ran out toward, don't even ask how I know those random facts, okay? Let's just not talk about that, okay? I know I'm going to get emails this week. How do you know this stuff? Don't ask. Laban ran out toward the man to the spring. As soon as he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms and heard the words, notice this. This is not important, or this is important. We shouldn't forget it. He notices the rings and the bracelet on his sister's arms and heard the words of his sister Rebekah. Thus the man spoke to me. He went to the man, and behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. He said, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside? For I have prepared the house and the place for the camels." So the man came to the house and unharnessed the camels and gave the straw and fodder to the camels. And there was water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. The food was set before him to eat, but he said, "I will not eat until I have said what I have to say." He said, "Speak on." So he said, "I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has greatly blessed my master, and he has become great. He has given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male servants and female servants, camels and donkeys. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and to him he has given all that he has. My master made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I dwell, but you shall go to my father's house and to my clan to take a wife for my son. And I said to my master, perhaps the woman will not follow me. But he said to me, the Lord before whom I have walked will send the angel with you, prosper your way. You shall take a wife for my son from my clan and from my father's house. Then you will be free from my oath when you come to my clan. And if they will not give her to you, you will be free from my oath. I came today and to the spring and said, "O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, if now you are prospering the way that I go, behold, I am standing by the spring of water. Let the virgin who comes out to draw water, to whom shall I say, please give me a little water from your jar to drink? And who will say to me, drink, and I will draw for your camels also? Let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son." Before I had finished speaking in my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her water jar on her shoulder, and she went down to the spring and drew water. I said to her, "Please let me drink." She quickly let down her jar from her shoulder and said, "Drink, and I will give your camels drink also." So I drank, and she gave the camels drink also. Then I asked her, "Whose daughter are you?" And she said, "The daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him." So I put the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her arms. Then I bowed my head and worshiped the Lord and blessed the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who had led me by the right way to take the daughter of my master's kinsman for his son. Now then, if you are going to show steadfast love and faithfulness to my master, tell me, and if not, tell me that I may turn to the right hand or to the left." Then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, "This thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son. And the Lord has spoken." When Abraham's servant heard the words, he bowed himself to the earth before the Lord. And the servant brought out jewelry, silver and gold, and garments, and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave her brother and her mother costly garments, and he and the men who were with him ate and drank, and they spent the night there. Did you catch all that? This is an incredible story. The servant is welcomed in by Laban, by the brother of Rebekah, who either by interest in the gold jewels or upon hearing the story is captivated and has become very hospitable to the servant of Abraham. Strange, right? The plot of finding Isaac a wife seems to be a very easy task, minus trekking across the wilderness on a camel for a long period of time, following the stars only, without a GPS. But other than that, the trip couldn't have gone any better. The first person he talks to happens to be the wife. Perfect story, right? Let's do this every day. When I go find a husband for my children, I'm just going to do this, right? Couldn't go any better. Just not going to tell the girls what I'm doing. But this just is not about just taking a trip and finding a wife. We find on display the faith of Abraham, the faith of the servant, and the worship of the servant time and time again. As he prays at the spring, bows in worship when she gives him the water, and again when he is with them in the home, we find the servant who recognizes the sovereignty of God by worshiping, bowing himself before the Lord. There is a need for marriage. There is a need for Isaac to have a wife. There is a need for the offspring of Abraham to continue. We cannot deny those things. Beyond the sovereignty of God at work here, there is a need for the line of Abraham to continue. It is a time for the promise to continue, for the promised line of Abraham. Isaac needs a wife. And Abraham, as the father, is the protector, the planner, the one who's going to see that Isaac finds the appropriate wife. The urgency is here. The time is now. But the urgency does not qualify for manipulation, or the need for manipulation, working by one's own might, or doing it your own way. Urgency, as we see here, only points us more to the need for God, for God's work, to trusting God, to worshiping God. For here we're reminded ultimately that the timing and the sovereignty of God is supreme. It's His time, His work. Just because Abraham is close to death doesn't mean it's time to start manipulating the plans or trying to figure out and do it our own way, as Frank Sinatra would say. It's not about how I did it, but how God is and has and will do it. God is sovereign, will be sovereign, and has been sovereign for all eternity and through all eternity. It's not about our way, it's about His way. Now in the impending death of Abraham, the promise to be a blessing to all nations is not in question. But the urgency of finding a wife will be carried out through the plans of God. The dependency on the king, as both Abraham and the servant demonstrate here, help teach us a dependency that we can have on the king even now. Surely it would have been easy to find a local bride. Surely it would have been easier to go out and start knocking on the doors of the neighbors saying, "Hey, do you have any daughters available? Do you have anybody who's available to be a suitable wife for Isaac?" But no, there is urgent importance here to find someone from the people of God to carry on the line of God for the purpose of God, and to trust that God knows what God is doing and that we don't. We don't have to know. We don't have to know the answers. Even the servant says, well, what if she doesn't come back? Abraham says, well, so be it. You're free of the oath. Move on with life. It's God's problem, not yours. You're not to drag her back here is the ultimate answer. If she doesn't come back, she doesn't come back. It's God's issue, not ours. You're not to take Isaac back there, is what he says in the opening of the chapter. The fact remains that Isaac needs a helpmate, but he doesn't need us to manipulate the situation. Rather, we are to be obedient, and he is to be obedient through this. This represents a dynastic people that God is bringing about for the purpose of bringing about his promise, through the purpose of bringing about his plan, through demonstrating his glory and his power and his sovereignty through the people of God, through his plan. That's what all of these 67 verses show. They don't have the answers. When you say, well, I need to go seek counsel for somebody, or I need to go get answers from somebody, why? They probably don't have the answers. It's not bad to seek counsel and to have questions and to have thoughts, but if they don't have the answers, don't chalk it up to God's not working or God is not big enough for that. Abraham, the man of faith, didn't have the answer. But God in his sovereignty did. When the servant prayed, God just in that moment happened to answer the prayer. But we go back and say, well, does God answer prayers every time that way? No. Remember, Abraham prayed in Genesis chapter 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and the prayer took 25 years to be answered for Isaac to be born. In this instance, in Genesis chapter 24, the servant prays, and before the word stops, the prayer is answered. Both instances represent faith. Both instances represent the sovereignty of God. Neither one of them show a lack of God working on behalf of his people, but both demonstrate that God is at work in the life of his people. Okay. Continuing in verse 54. When they rose in the morning, he said, send me away to my master. Her brother and her mother said, let the young women remain with us a while, and at least 10 days, which could be translated, by the way, for all you Bible scholars, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, 10 weeks, anywhere in that spectrum. After that, she may go. But he said to them, do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master. They said, let us call the young woman and ask her. And they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? She said, I will go. So they sent away Rebekah, their sister, and her nurse, and Abraham's servant and his men, and they blessed Rebekah and said to her, our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him. And then Rebekah and her young women arose and rode on the camels and followed the man. Thus the servant took Rebekah and went on his way. As they rise and the servant's request to leave and take Rebekah, there seems to be a bit of second guessing now. Am I really going to give my daughter to go off to the land of Abraham, who we haven't seen in decades? Is this really a great idea? Maybe we're going to have buyer's remorse here. Just give us a few days, weeks, years to think about this. We'll get back to you on that. You go ahead. Maybe we'll send her along at a later date. You just hold on. And the servant says, no. The Lord has shown us favor. Let us go. And so they said, let us ask Rebekah what her plan is. The time is now. The servant requests again that she come, and they ask her, and she says that she's going to go. This isn't a small thing. While this only encapsulates just a few verses in this whole chapter, the faith of Rebekah here is a huge theme Rebekah didn't get the promise of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, right? Rebekah didn't get that message. But here Rebekah demonstrates that same faith that Abraham had to go. Because here she takes her nurse and she goes to a land that she does not know, to people that she does not know, to marry a man she's never met. The faith of Rebekah here cannot be downplayed. She leaves behind everything to follow in the promise of God. That's point of faith number 3. We have Abraham's faith in buying the tomb, the servant's faith in going and praying, Rebekah's faith in leaving everything behind and going, knowing that she'll probably never return and never see her family again. How often do we do that? You don't do that unless you marry me, and then you end up traveling all across the country, and then when you go home again, well, not unless you just pack off and leave without me. You know what I'm saying? But no. This is her story. And we'll read later on, Isaac is about as great as Abraham was. Which, if you remember Abraham, he had a rough beginning. They bless Rebekah. Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him. Thousands upon 10,000s. They've promised Abraham, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. They bless her with that same promise. As we finish up this morning, it says, now Isaac had returned from that place, was a dwelling in the Negeb. I could have said that earlier. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening. Now this is important. This is going to get good. Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward the evening. He lifted his eyes and he saw, behold, there were camels coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes. And when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel and said to the servant, who is that man walking in the field toward us, or to meet us? The servant said, it is my master. So she took her veil, covered herself, and the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted in his mother's death. Remember, Isaac has been home all of this time. He has not been sent off to find his own wife. He was kept home. We don't even know if he knew what was going on. But there is Isaac in the land of the Negev, a detail that's rather important because this land is barren, as we mentioned earlier. There was not much around, but there was Isaac, Abraham, and all that belonged to them. As he's coming back from the field that evening from meditating, he looks up and he sees camels coming. I mean, can you just picture the scene? I mean, come on. Let's just get creative here for a minute, okay? Y'all just stop being so serious. He looks up, the sun is setting. You can see everything on the horizon. He's been meditating, trying to figure out his mother has died. He's in mourning. His dad is getting old. I mean, we're talking about old, close to 175. So when I'm talking about old, I'm not offending anybody here. We're talking about old, like rough and old. So he's old. So he's out there meditating. He starts walking back towards the camp, and there come these camels. Well, that's different. We don't get visitors out here. Why would we get visitors? There's nothing out here to visit. I mean, legitimately, unless they're coming to attack, we don't get visitors. But here come these camels riding. Oh, there's a woman on that camel. That's different. There's definitely there's no need for any of that out here. I mean, but here comes this beautiful lady riding in on this camel, and then she hops down. And can you picture this scene unfolding here? She hops down. She asks the servant, "Who is that man walking towards us?" She covers herself with her veil as would be respectful, not to just him, but mostly to God. If this is going to be a marriage, it's going to be a respectful marriage to God. They're going to do things the right way. They're going to do things in the way that honors God. This is not going to be a sham marriage, but this is going to be an honorable marriage. This 50-day journey, imagine this. For 50 days, she's been riding on this camel trying to figure out where she's going, who this guy is going to be, what's going on. Have I made the right choice? Is this really worth it? For 50 days, they've been riding on the back of this camel. Now they arrive. She sees this man off in the distance walking through is he a Looney Tune? What is he doing out here in the middle of nowhere? But here they are. She covers herself with her veil, and they have arrived. They have arrived to the ultimate perfection of what God has ordained. This marriage here, as we see in her covering herself, is not about sex. It's not about anything else other than God's divine orchestration. It's about love. It's about faithfulness. It's about following and being obedient to God. It's about having faith and trust in God. Isaac takes her to his mother's tent, the tent of the matriarch of the camp, and they marry. Notice in verse 67, underline this, it says, he loves her. He is committed to her. He loves her. God's plans matter. No matter what our circumstances are, they are perfect. God's sovereignty in every circumstance is absolutely perfect for our lives, from the smallest detail of traversing across the world, as we saw here, providing food in the famine, protection, childbearing, and now even a spouse for the son. What we might think is our responsibility because we are logical human beings, God again demonstrates is all part of his divine orchestration. He is but the conductor, and we are just a small part of the plan. This is the joy that we have, that we get to play a role in his plan. Abraham is the father of the nations. Rebekah is the mother who will carry on the line of Abraham. And you and I have the joy of carrying on the gospel to the nations. When we doubt, we must return to the Father and repent. We must wonder. We must come home when we wonder. We can't just hang out and say, where is God? We get to come home. We get to recognize that God is still God. He is still sovereign, and he is still active. Even like the 25 years when Abraham and Sarah were wondering, how is this going to work out? He is still sovereign. His plan is still good. He is still at work. Abraham stayed the course, refusing to let Isaac return home lest he be tempted. Abraham refused to allow Isaac to marry a neighbor lest he be tempted to worship an idol. How do we identify now with those temptations in our lives, in the lives of those that we disciple, in the lives of those that are in our lives, so that we can be used for the furtherance of the glory of God, our King? Abraham, at 175 years old, had much wisdom after much folly. We can't deny that. We have a lot to learn from this story of romance and fun. However, this isn't just a story of romance. It's not just about Isaac finding a wife. This story, remember, everything in Genesis points us to Jesus. When you look at this story, Abraham sending the head of the household, his servant, off to find a bride for Isaac. We also read in the New Testament where God himself sends his son as a servant in search of a bride. Only in the story that we know of the New Testament, the bride didn't come willingly, but rather yelled, crucify him, crucify him. Even his own followers denied him at the cross. But nonetheless, when we read in Revelation 19, which is where we read earlier, the marriage is prepared, and for Christ completed the sacrifice for his bride. He has paid the price. He has shown the love through his death on the cross for our sins, leaving to prepare a home for us. but promising yet to come back again. This is the hope we have. This is the completion that we live in. This is ultimately about God's promise to provide a bride for his son. Jesus is the one in which all the promises are filled. The bridge of the Lamb is the church, and to get to the bridge, the Lord came and he sought her out. Do we see this? The servant being sent out represents Jesus being sent to the church. We are the church. Jesus is coming back for his church. Our response now should be, I will follow you. I will go. I will be obedient. I will love you. I will no longer crucify him, but I am yours. It's not about saying crucify, but it's I love you. I want you. I want to be with you. I trust you. The mere fact that we are in this room today is a demonstration that he is a promise-keeping God. Because without that, without the fact of him keeping his promises, that none of this happens. This isn't just a book of good stories that happen, because without him keeping his promise, without this story coming to completion, like this is one story leading us to Jesus. Jesus coming, Jesus living, Jesus dying, the promise being made complete. We are living in light of the promises of God. Throughout all of this, we see him coming. We are in the promise. So now we have the choice as people, whether we will love him, whether we will be redeemed by him, or whether we will continue to say crucify him and live a life against him and turn our lives from him and walk the other way. This is a beautiful story in Genesis chapter 24. It's a long story, but it's a beautiful story. The question is for us now, what is our response in light of the gospel? Because the marriage that we see proposed in Genesis chapter 24 is the marriage that we see proposed in the gospel. Will we say yes? Or will we say maybe at another time when it's more convenient? Rebecca left everything behind, demonstrating as the bride that it was worth it to leave and to go. And likewise, the proposal has been made to us. Will we stop and leave everything behind and be adorned with the love and the greatness of Christ to live in the city and the kingdom that is God's and say yes, forsaking all that? Rebecca demonstrates that the call of Christ is often about leaving family, if it be so, and following him, leaving all possessions behind, as we see in the story of the rich young ruler, and following him at great cost. Will we be willing to say yes to the King, or we say that cost is just too much? This is the message of the gospel. We don't get to parse it out and say, well, I like parts A and part B and part C, but I'm going to keep D, E, and F for myself because I like these things. These things are good. I enjoy this part of life. Well, if you enjoy this part of life, then it's probably more important than the kingdom. Rebecca demonstrates the forsaking of all else in pursuit of the bridegroom. This morning, as we conclude our time of worship together, that's the question that we ultimately ask. What is it for us to know the gospel? Even as believers, when we see the demonstration of faith, what is it for us to live the gospel? Maybe we've been believers for decades, or maybe we've been believers for a week, or maybe we're not believers at all. The question is, what is it for us to know the gospel? We see the gospel presented in this story in Genesis chapter 24. The question remains, do we live a gospel people transformed and renewed and set free by the power of Christ? Or do we still live in the land where we have everything that we had before, in the old homeland, holding on to everything? This morning, as we close our time of worship, I urge you to ask that question. It's not going to be easy, but true faith asks. True faith trusts. True faith follows Christ to the kingdom. Because that's where our home is. He loved her. We'll see in just a few chapters that even that love was greatly flawed. The promise we have from God is the love of Christ has no flaws. Will never let us down. The love of our spouses, we're all messed up. So even that is flawed. But the love of Christ is infinitely perfect. He loved her. Christ loves us. This morning as we pray, let your heart hear and know the gospel. Let's pray together. God, we are grateful for your gospel message this morning, and I pray that for any of us here this morning who may not know, would hear it and receive it, be transformed. God, I pray for those who are here and who have struggled with the gospel message for years, that they would come and repent and know your love. Let us be a people who are sincere and true. Transform each of us this morning. It's in your name we pray.